Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I need you to go to jointheunion.us. That's jointheunion.us. First thing I need you to do, sign up for our email list. Guys, we have a lot of work to do in the next couple of years. Second, if you can, I need you to make a contribution today. We need grassroots-powered fundraising to help us get this machine up and running. That's jointheunion.us. Thanks, everybody. And on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm once again joined by Trygve Olson, an expert on the dangers of authoritarianism and an international and domestic defender of democracy. Trygve is president of the public affairs and political consulting firm Viking Strategies, LLC, and a weekly panelist and crowd favorite on the Todd Allbaugh Show. Today, he's coming to us from the Washington, D.C. area. Trygve, welcome back.
I think it depends on the crowd, Reed, but I do have a few fans.
Yeah. Oh, listen, that's true for both of us. So, all right, man. Well, listen, it's been a few months since we had you on, and before then, it was pre-election. We didn't know how things are going to turn out. Now we know. As folks are listening to this, we're T-minus a week from Donald Trump and co. retaking the White House and all of its attendant executive authority. So before we get into, some of the cast of characters, the dramatis personae of Trump 2.0, give us a sense of what you've been doing and how you see the world here.
As you know, I took a little bit of time off, which was nice. And I really tried to unplug. And I would say for our listeners out there, I had 2 weeks over Christmas where I just turned off social media. I turned off my phone. I spent time with my kids. As you know, I took them skiing, which they hadn't done, and I hadn't skied in quite some time. So I felt that in some muscles that I didn't really realize. And I turned 57, which might be part of it too. But have been continuing doing what I do, which is spending a lot of time talking with people about some of my experiences abroad with autocracy and democracy. I have told a lot of people we have to be taking deep breaths, and we have to recognize that we can't fight every battle, nor is that the best way to go about what is going to happen and unfold. We have to pick our spots, and we have to keep in mind how you effectively counter these things and understand at a foundational level that there are going to be attempts to make people afraid to have conversations with each other about what they think, afraid to go out and say something is wrong. There will be an attempt to make it all normal. And there will be lots of people who will appease. But we need to take deep breaths on that, and we need to really stay focused because, as Roosevelt said after World War II, the only thing we really have to fear is fear itself at the end of the day. And that doesn't mean there aren't things we shouldn't be afraid of, but we can't let the fear overwhelm us. That's what they want.
It's interesting that that's where you start, because I've been trying to really be, impress upon both the folks listening and watching this and the folks that read what I write is that, the race hasn't started yet. The contest has not yet begun. And if you're on the sideline, running wind sprints up and down before we ever really understand what's ahead of us, then you're going to be exhausted for the fight. I think there's also, I think dialogue is important, Trig, but I am a little bit cautious of where dialogue crosses into the echo chamber, where it's just a lot of people saying the same things to each other, which is fine. Like if that's a good emotional or psychological outlet for you, I think it's fine as far as it goes. But I think that, what we have also learned, and we continue to learn the hard way, is that much of what the chattering class is worried about, and don't get me wrong when I say this, there are plenty of legitimate things to worry about, but what the chattering class is worried about and what the mainstream media and the national news is worried about is often, literally and figuratively 1,000 miles from the people's lives who we need to convince to, help us stop this stuff or pull the lever a different way, in local elections, state elections, midterm elections as they come online.
it actually is part of what they try and do, from what I've, in my experiences in other places. And we're seeing that in many ways, right? The implosion of Twitter and the fact that you now have an alternative in Blue Sky. And, I've gone on Blue Sky myself, and I haven't gone on Twitter for quite a while. I kept my account just because I don't want somebody to steal it. But what you're seeing and what these kinds of actors try and do is divide everybody into camps. You're either in the in group or the out group, and they want echo chambers. And so, and that's what we now have in sort of that Twitter short form social media space. I don't know what they call it, news information space, whatever they call it. You have people on the right, they're all opining on Twitter to each other and passing around what they pass. And on people on the other side of them, now I'll move to Blue Sky. And that's not really healthy. And we're seeing that across various elements of society, right? We've seen that in terms of people tend to be, we see that in terms of red states and blue states. There's very few states, I think there's probably 4, that have senators from 2 different parties. Okay. There's my home state of Wisconsin. There's Pennsylvania now is one of those states. But I'm struggling to think of any others. Montana's no longer that. That's no longer the case. I don't know if there are any others, actually, Reed, right? That is not the way it used to be. Even when Bill Clinton was elected the second time, I think there were 22 states that were split.
Not only is that true about the senators, and this is a longer discussion for down the line a bit too, is that there are a lot of places where there was a Democratic senator in a, let's say, more red state that no longer exists, and Democrats have just abandoned the field, right? And so the number of places where Democrats, or especially in a place like the United States Senate, are even competing, and what I mean is not just putting somebody up, but competing for an actual win, is much smaller now than it was certainly when Bill Clinton was in office, and even when Barack Obama was in office. And so that's, that creates downstream problems, which is if the Democrats in the United States Senate, the best they can ever hope for is like 51, right? Then every 2 years is yet another existential struggle.
Well, and you and I were out in Wisconsin for 10 days or something like that before the election, right? Traveling around. Now, Wisconsin's a fascinating case study because you had Trump win the state and you had Tammy Baldwin reelected. She was in a really tough fight, but she got more. Her margin of victory was bigger than Donald Trump's. And you have Ben Winkler, who, is my fellow Wisconsinite and who I've gotten to know a little bit. We used to be on the opposite sides of things, and now we tend to agree on more things. If you look at that race, and Ben's now running for DNC chair, and kind of running a campaign against the status quo, one of the things that he's been pushing is this need to compete everywhere. And part of the reason Tammy Baldwin won, actually, the reason she won from a voter pattern standpoint, was the fact that she ran substantially better in rural parts of Wisconsin with white working guys than Harris did. And she confronted the trans ads that were being run against her, $30 million of them, directly to camera and said, Eric Hovde is lying. The Harris campaign didn't do that. Democrats have got to start competing with these people and their ideas and not be afraid of them. But at the same time, they have to recognize that you don't compete with those people by throwing policy prescriptions to them. You compete by building narratives around things that they care about, and more importantly, perhaps directly countering when false narratives are being pushed. And you heard Todd and I talk about it, because obviously that issue of the ads came up when we were on the air in Wisconsin. Todd and I were getting calls about trans people transitioning to play sports in Wisconsin. It's not even a thing. I called my friend who is the head of the WIAA. There's 6 instances of it, and every single one of those kids at birth was, a decision had to be made because they were both genders, basically. And so it's not really a thing. Baldwin confronted it. Harris didn't. And Ben in the Democrat Party of Wisconsin, as we saw, was competing everywhere. We went and met with students on every campus who were handing out literature. That was not the case everywhere. And that's part of the reason why they have the problems they have. And I think if he's elected, he'll fix that. I'm not sure that if some of the other candidates who are sort of more of the consultant status quo class are going to do that.
Well, and I mean, I saw on social media just this morning before we started recording, Trygve, that Ben said that, you know, if he's elected, the first thing he will do is a complete audit of every consulting contract. What have you done? How much are you getting paid? Is your time worth it? Is the money worth it? And look, you know, there is, like, let's not be under any illusions. Like the DNC, like any major political party, is a massive cash cow. Right? It will raise tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in small dollar donations over the course of the next, year or two. And there are a lot of people who, it's an annuity for them, right? Oh yeah, I got my contract. And the RNC was the same way, right? That's not an unusual thing.
And now it is for a bunch of people in Trump orbit.
Right. I think that's the right thing for Ben to do. I think it's the right thing for the DNC as much as it really is effective, affects you and me personally. But like, that's also a lot of, there's going to be a lot of internal resistance to something like that. Well, don't you know who I am? I've been doing this. I represent this group. I have these benefactors. And so I think that we have to be very clear that if these guys and gals want to start winning, like they gotta rethink everything they're doing, because what they've been doing is, one, taking advantage. And again, they don't do either of these things, Trygve, from my perspective, proactively. They're the recipients of it. One, there's only two parties. Right. So they're always going to have at least 47% of the vote. And two, American voters in this time are incredibly fickle. So if they don't like who they got another choice. And it's not like they're proactively, again, voting for the Democrat. It's like, I'm sick of the Republican, or they're an idiot. Right. So I'll vote for the Democrat.
Or they don't share my values is the big one. Right.
But that's a much bigger issue. Right. I spoke to an activist who previously lived in Michigan, now lives in Minnesota, but went back every weekend during the fall to canvass, and said, I thought there were times when I was talking to people, I felt like as a Democrat, I didn't even have standing to talk to these people. And I think I felt that certainly. Right. And again, we're not Democrats. But if you're going out there and you're trying to, speak on behalf of a candidate or a group of candidates or a slate or a party, and you could tell like that someone's eyes go hollow when you start talking to them, even when they should be people for you, there's a much deeper issue.
100%. I think the other thing that, listeners should contemplate, and Democrats more broadly, but listeners should contemplate it, in the ones who are Democrats, in terms of the mechanics of all of this. All votes are equal, but not all votes are not created equal, if that makes sense, right? Like in a presidential election, a vote in California counts the same as a vote in Wisconsin, but votes in Wisconsin are worth a lot more because of the closeness of the state and the electoral college, right? And I've thought about this a fair amount, and I'd love your perspective on this. As we were traveling around the state of Wisconsin, we were targeting and traveling to areas that tended to have competitive congressional races. Obviously, the presidential race was competitive across the state. The Senate race, statewide races were competitive. But we were traveling to places that had competitive local races, assembly, state Senate, and congressional races. Those votes, an additional Democratic vote for either party, quite frankly, in those places that translates down ballot is worth far more than an additional vote in a place where you're going to lose anyway, some other state, or even within the state, places that you're going to win all the down ballot races and statewide. Because if you can shift those margins, those small numbers from 20 to 30 in some of these places, it's going to help your statewide candidates, but you may end up winning these local races. Republicans are really smart about that. And in states like Wisconsin, I think they're smart because they're getting smarter about it, and they're really cognizant of it, right? Because in northern Wisconsin, which they focused on, there aren't as many votes, but there's far more seats. So the key thing I think that Democrats need to think in blue states is where are those places, or certainly ones that are red states, particularly the red states, is where start at the bottom level. Where are assembly races that are potentially winnable, but we're not? And how do we impact going from 25% to 20 to 30% in those places, right? That each step that you go up the ladder to congressional statewide, they're magnified, they're amplified. There's an amplifier to that.
And that's the one thing, what I think, the things that we will be working on at the union over the course of the next 12 to 24 months is making sure that wherever there's a race, right, that a MAGA Republican has an opponent. And frankly, if it's a Democrat, I think that's great, but like we shouldn't assume that it wouldn't be an independent, right? We saw Dan Osborne ran a hell of a race in Nebraska, right? Great. He was independent enough that he didn't just get tagged as the Democrat, right? He ran a competitive race. And I think that, from my perspective, if the Democrats don't want to do it, then we'll find somebody who will. But I think the other point, not only about the vote share, but I think it's also incredibly important that if you can take a state and make it Tennessee or whatever, right, where you have someone running in every district, statewide, legislative, congressional, whatever, there will be a natural by osmosis, people will have done the work. You're going to create new opportunities. You're going to win. You might win one you didn't expect, right? You might win a couple you didn't expect. You might find a couple of stars candidate-wise that, okay, maybe they didn't win the first time around, but we learned so much. You could find new people who are staff and activists, right, who had never been given the opportunity because they live in Bucksnort, Tennessee, right? And it's been, MAGA red forever. But I think what this all comes down to, Trygve, and I've used this word a lot, and the viewers and listeners have heard it, is work. Like, this is work. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of people. The resources, I hope, will come. That's the other part too, is that, Democrats, and I think especially Democratic donors, like I think a lot of them feel like they got burned. I feel like a lot of them, at least that I've spoken to, feel like they didn't get the whole story as they were dumping more and more and more money, and they were raising more and more and more money, that they were getting the whole truth from the powers that be. And so I think they feel a little bit burned, and now we have to say, like, I get it, but you know what? Like, the fight isn't over. Whereas, our old party, they're like the Alabama football team, right? They just reload. Okay, it's 2025. Here we go. And, that's one thing, just to transition a little bit, as I've been listening to Steve Bannon's podcast a little bit more now. I don't recommend that for otherwise normal human beings. But the one thing he said when I was listening yesterday, Trig, was when you've got him on the ropes, right, double down. And, so he's under no illusion that, like, they have an opportunity probably for the next couple, 4 years, right, to do a lot of the things that they want to do that are still, I think, broadly unpopular. He's not going to take his foot off the gas for the next 4 years, right? He's going to do everything he can. And I think that's one thing that if we can impart both to the folks listening and also to our friends that are in the Democratic Party, is like, you have to understand you're going to have to match some intensity. Because they're going to be fighting on all fronts everywhere. And to your point, we have to choose the places where we can make some progress, where we can win. And it's not going to be, reacting to every crazy tweet. I mean, think about like Greenland, okay, like who the hell knows what's going to happen with Greenland, but does it require, 62 more Substack posts and 8,000 Twitter posts and 2,200 Blue Sky posts? It doesn't. You know why? Because none of us know the first damn thing about Greenland, right? This is his superpower. Like, he says, I want Greenland. He sends Don Jr. up there as a massive troll, right? And everybody talks about it. Like, you don't need, like, that's not where the fight is.
I agree with that 100%. And it's also not where the fight is until he calls, he's in office and he says, I'm sending the 101st Airborne is going to parachute into Greenland. Then it's something. I got into it with somebody who on social media, on DMing, who was going on and on as all the appointments were rolling out, and Sean Duffy was named Secretary of the Department of Transportation, right? Former congressman from northern Wisconsin. His wife is on Fox News, whatever. first of all, it's Secretary of Transportation. Who the hell cares? If LaHood and the guy from Iowa that George H.W. Bush had, like, who cares? Like, I couldn't, other than LaHood, I don't think I could even name a Secretary of Transportation. And actually, Ray LaHood was a really good guy, right? Like, who cares? Second of all, Sean Duffy is a former congressman who did a lot of transportation stuff, perfectly qualified. Like, not Matt Gaetz, not Kash Patel. He's not Tulsi Gabbard. He's not Hagstead, right? Like, this is a very different deal. And yet this person's like, oh, we've got to fight every one of these. I'm like, no, you don't. You really don't. Like, and it's a waste of time, energy, and effort to be doing that. But there is this desire to fight every battle, and that you have to pick your spots.
Especially when, I feel a little bit like, I'm going to overstate it here, Trig, but I feel like we're a little bit like, the British after Dunkirk, right? Like, we've been pushed off the continent. We left all the tanks and guns and everything on the beach, and we got all the guys back, right? But like, we now have to say, okay, we can win this fight, but like, what is it going to take? And it's not going to be going back across the channel 6 weeks from now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. To pivot back to what you're saying about listening to Bannon, it makes me think of something that really is true, I think. And I don't know what they teach at Democrat campaign school, right? Because I've never gone to one, nor have I ever really been a Democrat. But I do know what they teach you at Republican campaign schools when you're young. First thing is and this is a short synopsis. First thing is Al Davis, just win, baby.
Right.
That's number one. Number two is build narratives. Don't throw policy prescriptions. Build narratives. Find one example, even if it's, a shopping mall in St. Louis, make a war on Christmas out of it. If there's 6 kids who happen to be both genders in the state of Wisconsin, spend 61% of your dollars on trans ads that is 85 to 15% people are against. The last one, which is the one you're getting to about Bannon, is when you have your foot on your opponent's throat, don't ease up, press harder. And that, I don't think those are the messages. I think in Democratic campaign school, we want to win so we can do things. 2, throw out policies for every constituency because they're ultimately rational. And 3, well, if you have your foot on your throat, that's not nice. So ease up a little.
Yeah, but that's not what Harry Reid ever would have thought, right?
No, it's not Nancy Pelosi either. The ones who have had success subscribe to Barack Obama and others, Bill Clinton, the Clintons, right? They subscribe to the first 3.
I frankly see that energy in a lot more of the activists that I've gotten to know over the last few years, Trygve, who are, for lack of a better way to put it, outsiders, right? They're not the establishment. They are the people who are doing the hard work out in states. They're often underfunded, understaffed. They punch above their weight. The better they do, the more the party apparatus gives them a hard time for it or tries to push them out. And I've said this for a long time, like, if Democrats want to be the white hats, they have to act like the good guys. If they want to win, they have to want to win. And if you want to do the things necessary to protect all the people you say you want to protect, then you have to win elections, right? But understand, too, that if there's a particular group of people or whatever it is, right, thing that you desperately care about, but your voters don't care about it or are opposed to it, then you have to find another way to win, right? And oh, that's underhanded, Reed. Oh, you're lying to people. Oh, you're not like, no. You just have to understand the playing field. Like, I've always thought, Trygve, that polling, which, gets rightfully a bad name, for me has always been more interesting on the front end of a campaign than as a directional piece for a campaign, which is, where is the world? What are these people caring about, right? And then you can develop, something and then lead with assertion, lead with values. And my guess is, and we've seen this in some of the work that we've done over the years, is that voters will follow you. But it's not like, well, you tell me what you want and then I'll give it to you, because they're like, well, no, because you always say that and you never give it to me.
Well, then that gets into, as you know, I've done a lot of research over a long period of time. And more recently, I've really been focusing on psychology of individuals and how that translates to politics. And we as humans, there's 2 types of thinking we do. It's the old book, Think Fast, Think Slow. First is system 1 thinking. System one thinking is the amygdala of your brain, which is stuff that you don't even think about. It's your subconscious. That's 95% of your thinking.
Right. You're breathing. Your eyes blink. Right.
The other is conscious thinking that's done through your frontal lobe. That's 5%. And if listeners think back to when they were learning how to drive, and this is relevant for guys like Reed and I, because we're about to go through that with daughters. Mine starting in about literally on the 12th, she can apply for a learner's permit.
Yeah, I've got 6 months.
Me.
I've got 6 months to prepare myself. Yes.
But when you're first learning to drive, you're having to conscientiously think, gas pedal, brake. Oh my gosh, is there someone on my right? I have to turn the wheel. You're thinking about all of that. You give it, and that's all type 2, system 2 thinking, right? Now, fast forward 6 months, a year, or 40 years, like guys like you and I, you're eating a sandwich, you're doing all kinds of things that you probably shouldn't be doing.
You're listening to the radio, you're on the phone, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, a ton of stuff. And you're not thinking about those things, sometimes to your detriment, right? It's why texting is so toxic, because then you're completely not even system one thinking.
Right.
So system one thinking is primarily habit. In the research that I was doing, and I just looking at, for example, Republicans, people are more system one or system two dominant, and you can test that. And we did test that. System two thinkers, people who are predominantly do more system two thinking, and we're doing system two thinking about the elections. 40% of Republicans who are system two dominant voted for Harris. Mm-hmm. Amongst the rest, which is most of the population who are system one thinking, voted for Trump. And when we think about why do some of these people go along with Trump, even though they're uncomfortable, they don't like the tweets, but vote for him for the policies. That's classic system one, right? Because that piece of your brain is habit. It's habit for them. And that part of their brain, unless they use conscientious thinking, which is tiring, they're going to go to the default. That's how we're wired. Right? So when things like, and this gets to the trans ad, which gets so much talking, when one side is doing ads like that reinforce system one thinking, and people have a lot of other stuff going on, they think, yep, not like me, not doing it. When the other side is, primary outside group Future Forward is lighting $1 billion on fire, running ads about inflation, assuming people are rational. Rationality requires you to use your conscientious brain to think about your situation. And that's what you ended up with, competing with each other. And the truth is, there are big events that reset. For example, mostly events that we see directly. January 6th was an event like that. 9/11 was an event. Everybody was watching it. They weren't in New York, they weren't in Washington, but they were living it. So they're conscientiously thinking about it. But what happens in the aftermath for some is they're turning on Fox, they're going to websites, etc., where there's a real effort to reprogram it to system one thinking and those habits and playing in those things. And so when system two events happen, say Donald Trump does decide, I don't think he will, but say he announces at his speech that his first act is to send the 101st Airborne to Greenland. That would be a system two event. People would actually be thinking, is this a good idea, whatever. Democrats need to be far better at keeping that top of mind and reprogramming the habits. It's like quitting smoking or whatever, right? You have to reset it, and you only reset it by conscientious system two thinking.
Bannon, whenever he refers to Joe Biden, it's the illegitimate regime, that they stole it from Trump in 2020. Even now, Trygve, a week away from Trump retaking office, he still does it every time he mentions Joe Biden. Like, that's not an accident, to your point, right? That's the default now is, yeah, he stole it. Of course he stole it. The other part too, and I think this is really important, is why there's so many, Republicans like you guys used to be, how come, more didn't, vote for Harris or stay home? Because Trump is the Republican Party, right? And we have two parties, R and D, and, he is the Republican. Okay. Like, yeah, I don't really like him, but I've been a Republican for 60 years. I'm never going to be a Democrat. I don't like anything they do. I've never liked anything they do. He's our guy. All right. You know, and that's like, here's the thing. He's the extreme version, but that's not exactly new either, right? Do you think people loved Richard Nixon, right? No, but he was the Republican, and the Democrat was wholly unacceptable to a soft Republican or anybody else.
And think about the reflexivity and the thinking on that, right? It's easier for them to say, well, I'm a Republican. I'm not really comfortable with this, but I don't want to invest the time and energy mentally that it takes to really think it through. So I'm going to just accept the easy answer. And the two biggest determinants, and I've spent a lot of time looking at this, and there's been a lot of others who have too, but the two biggest determinants in how you vote over the long term, do you know what they are? Number one is how your parents voted. And number two is who you cast your vote for in the first election.
Right.
And to reset that, it's as hard as quitting smoking or drinking or whatever, right? You literally, if you go through that process, and it's why you can slip back into it very easy. But then big events, you talk to people who've quit a habit like that. It's typically a big event that resets them, right? That they can't ignore. And the things that we have to focus on when those events happen, drilling them in and making it about that.
And that's the other part too that our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, you know, don't often understand, is that you have to say the thing and then you have to say it again and again and again and again and again, right? It's not necessarily creative. It's not necessarily exciting, right? But to your point, I mean, you know, back in the days of gross rating points, Trygve, right? I mean, you had to buy 1,000 so that every voter you were trying to target would see it like, 10 times or whatever the cockamamie math was. But because they knew if you only saw it one time, it was going to come and go, right? You had to keep pounding it into their heads. Why is it that, you know, you have to have 10 or 15 different contacts with a voter, you know, before you feel like they're totally covered? Why is it that you have to meet a person in a fairly intimate setting, not once, not twice, but 3 times before you feel like you have some connection to them? Because it takes time to build those things. The other part too, as you said, is, you know, the cognitive dissonance that has to occur for someone to break away is hard. That's why I've always said, like, MAGA buys in bulk, but it sells one at a time, right? Because it's easier to do the thing. And that's not abnormal. That's the normal thing. That's herd. Why does the herd stick together? Because 18 antelope out by themselves, all a quarter of a mile apart, you know, target-rich environment for hyenas and lions and everything else.
So I'll tell you a funny story because you made me think of this. You knew W and had far more interactions with him, obviously, when you worked for him in the governor's office than I did. But I was talking to somebody who we both know that understands the political worlds of both he and his father well. And this person said to me one time, you know what the difference between W and HW as candidates is W was less of an intellectually curious person. So you put a speech and a message in front of him, and he had no problem going to Des Moines and giving it, and then later the same day going to Dearborn and giving it, and then going to New Hampshire and giving it, and never thought twice about the fact that he's saying the same thing. Where HW, he'd go to Des Moines, give one speech, get to Dearborn and decide, hey, they've already given this speech. I got to give something slightly different and tweak it. By the time he got to the 5th stop of the day, he was totally off message talking about something else. And that's why one got elected twice and the other one didn't.
Right. No, I think that's right.
Democrats really have a tendency to do that, right? The other thing that Democrats, they can't do this time. They did it before. I say this all the time. And I think Ben gets this. What do Democrats do the last time they lost bad? They wrote a book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Like, it's not what's the matter with us. It's why are these rubes so stupid they won't vote for us in Kansas?
Right.
Right? Like, there's nothing the matter with Kansas. The matter is you're not resonating with the people in Kansas.
And that's my point too, is about, you know, you can imagine a world as you would like it to be. Great. Unfortunately, the world is the way it is, whether you like it or not. Now, The question is, what are you going to do to apply the things you would like to have happen to the world as it exists, and not throw tantrums and get upset and say, how come they're so dumb? Because as you know, and I know, telling somebody they're stupid is a really bad way to engage them in a conversation, right? You're too dumb to understand what I'm saying, but you should do what I'm saying anyway. Okay. How often in the course of humanity has that ever worked? I don't think ever. Not in a political setting, not in a friendship setting, not in a work setting, not in an interpersonal setting. Insulting somebody before asking them for a favor is typically not going to get you what you want. And that's not a complicated thing to understand until and unless you've decided that you are so much smarter that if you keep saying these things that are smart, that somehow by osmosis, Trygve, like the dumb people will understand.
Right.
So let me switch gears. So I want to talk a little bit about, we think about Donald Trump, we think about MAGA, and, there is Trump himself, and then, there's the various outcroppings. And I'm thinking about this almost in a physics capacity. Like MAGA is an atom, right? And Trump is the magnetism that holds all those, subatomic particles together, and they've got these electrons on the outside. So if the core, right, is the White House and Trump, and people like Russ Vought, who's going to run OMB, he's one of the key authors of Project 2025, and Susie Wiles, who's going to be the chief of staff, whose job it is to keep the chaos internally to a dull roar so they can do all these things that, again, as I said earlier, are broadly unpopular. You have two massive electrons in a Bannon and the other one on an Elon Musk who do not like one another. And they represent very different portions of the MAGA movement. Bannon represents the populist, working class, mostly white people, right? Elon Musk represents the wealthy, right? The powerful, those that would control everybody. And I'm not saying that Bannon is good. Don't get me wrong. I think he is crazy and evil, but he's not stupid. But in an interview with an Italian newspaper last week, Trygve, Bannon said he would do everything to make sure that Elon Musk was gone before Inauguration Day. I don't think he'll be able to pull that off. And then he went through this whole thing about, we don't want these, tech, crypto, fascist people in charge. We don't want this. We don't want that. And it was weird. I was like, Bannon's nuts, but the things he was saying about Musk weren't wrong. Does that make sense? And I was like, wait a second, what world am I living in now where like I agree with something that guy is saying?
As I've gone from November 6th forward, a lot of my time has been spent thinking about what does the power structure work like? Like, better than listeners would. Like I've spent a lot of my life going into countries and analyzing what do power structures look like, right? Vertical or horizontal. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and sort of analyzing it. I sort of see that there are four core groups that all have Trump's ear at the moment. And I will tell you, even numbers don't usually work very well for vertical power structures. The best number is 3, because then you can play elements off of each other. 4 is complicated because you can have 2 on one side, 2 on the other, and you have shifting alliances. And it's hard for the person who's on top of that, who's 1, to align. So I think you have 4 groups. First group is mainstream enablers. Okay. Probably the most prominent of those is Susie, but Chris LaCivita, who ran the campaign, would be in that group. Marco Rubio, there's a lot of them. The ones in, a lot of the senators, Thune, even to a degree. And what do they want, right? Like they want things to be the way they are. Yep. The ones on the outside want lobbying, political consulting contracts. The ones on the inside want, to be able to leave and probably get those kinds of contracts. And in the meantime, have a legacy. And they're not going to stray too far from Republican orthodoxy. And you and I first met Susie Wiles and her husband on John McCain's campaign. Right. So there's that. Second group is the kleptocrats, Elon, Peter Thiel, Ramaswamy, they're primarily Silicon Valley. There's that guy, David Sachs, right? They tend to be very libertarian, but they're really about their economic interests and expanding them. Third group is cultural reformists, the Mike Johnsons of the world, the ones who are the true believers and want to control government to impose their cultural values, right?
Yeah.
And then the fourth is what I call the fourth turning people. And by fourth turning, I mean the book, The Fourth Turning. That's like Bannon, the libertarian wing, the crypto bros. Like what we're seeing with all of these right now is in some cases they have common alliance. In some cases, they're trying to slice each other's throats. Because I think there's a realization that and Bannon probably is smarter about politics than Elon, although Elon has a lot more money and is smart, maybe more Machiavellian in terms of how he made it. Although they're both probably pretty Machiavellian. I think there's an understanding by Bannon that if they can take out the kleptocrats, that a lot of those kleptocrats share that fourth turning crypto sort of mindset worldview, and that would make them dominant over the other two. Okay.
Yeah.
And that these things work better in threes. But as you know, I'm kind of usually a glass half full guy, which works out great because I think my spouse tends to be more glass half empty and we balance each other out. But as time goes on, I'm becoming more pessimistically glass half full. So as I think about this, I'm planning for the worst, which is I think somehow they figure it out and then you get the worst instincts of all of them. And you do have the 101st Airborne landing in Greenland. Not so much because some of them want the land. The kleptocrats want the rare earth minerals that are there so they can build more electric cars, etc. That's worst case scenario. But there's a piece of me that thinks probably what we're going to get is best case, which is they all spend so much time fighting with each other. It really slows them down in terms of getting anything accomplished. And they have these grand ambitions and one of them puts it out there and then the other ones attack it and then it pulls back because Trump's like, well, this is going too far and you have gridlock.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, in that context, right? On one of the Sunday shows, maybe it was Meet the Press, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, I think they did this on purpose to make him the scapegoat for it, was said that that people who had been at the Capitol on January 6th who were in prison for nonviolent offenses, Trygve, would be pardoned, but those who had committed violent acts would not be. That would seem to me to be a pretty strong statement against the Bannon wing, right? That I made an assumption, and I who knows, maybe it was a test balloon, a trial balloon, but I just assumed that they'd let them all out. This is a whole different thing. And so how do those people who are in prison for committing violent acts, like the Stuart Rhodes or the Proud Boys guy, like how are they going to react? Right? Because, they're going to serve another 6 months, another 12 months. They were promised, I promise you, that they were going to get out.
A couple of them got 6 years.
Right. So I think Stuart Rhodes got 12. So how is that wing, that militant extremist wing of MAGA going to react when something that was, from their perspective, probably pretty fundamental is now being told is not going to happen?
I don't actually know, but I think we can assume probably not well. Like they felt like they had a deal, and now they're learning you make a deal with Donald Trump. It isn't worth the paper it's written on. I worry about that with whatever's gone on with him and Putin, right? Like, that Nikolai Patrushev, who's Putin's right hand, and if you know that world, is as close to Putin as anybody, and is a real knuckle dragger. He makes Putin look like a nice guy, like the Dalai Lama or something. Patrushev was publicly quoted as saying, well, Donald Trump's an honorable man and he made certain promises and we expect him to keep them, or he will pay the consequences for that. Right. Like I worry about that. And honestly, that's a bigger deal than him reneging on the Proud Boys.
For sure.
But no, it kind of gets to my point, Reed. Like, they're not stupid. And La Savita and Tony the pollster, Tony Fabrizio, they're not stupid. That's a 90-10 issue. I have data. I've asked about that, right? Like 90% of Americans think people who beat up cops on January 6th shouldn't be pardoned. So, but here again, look at how they did it. Well, let's throw J.D. Vance under the bus so that Donald Trump doesn't have to be the bad guy. But yeah, that's the problem that they're going to have until they figure out how to build that effective vertical. And it's our job to disturb, disrupt, and diminish their ability to do that. And hopefully, this is the other thing that Democrats and people who don't like this need to understand. If somebody is against what you're against, they're your ally in that moment.
Right.
Regardless of who they are. So if it's the Stalin rule, I say this every time I'm on your podcast, every other podcast, every time. Roosevelt and Churchill, two of the greatest leaders in the history of humanity, for God's sakes, recognized that they had to get in bed with Joseph Stalin, the second worst person to probably ever walk the planet, because they were going up against the worst. And here's the thing, for guys like you and I, being on the same team as AOC on some issue isn't all that comfortable. But you need to do it. And if AOC is saying, oh, I don't want to be with those guys, well, then you get what you deserve.
Right.
And it goes the other way too.
Yeah. I'm willing to work with anybody who's willing to work with me. Not everyone is. All right.
Right.
All right, Trig, before we let you go, where can folks, if any of these social networks are still viable, where can folks find you?
So they can find me on my Twitter feed at Trygve Olson, although I don't tweet very much. And they can find me on Blue Sky, which, to be honest, I don't know. It's Trygve Olson and then whatever.
Right.
But yeah, you can Blue Sky. To be honest, I haven't been doing as much social media. I'll be writing on it more. But more importantly, people can find me on the Civic Media Radio app, the Todd Allbaugh Show. I'm on every Wednesday. And I think we talk a lot about Wisconsin, which is the purplest of state, but we really focus on national issues. Reed, you spent a week with us on the road. I think people all across the country would find that interesting. And I think, if you download the Civic Media app, you'll find a ton of quality programming, and hopefully Civic Media is able to take their model of a radio network, which they've built all across Wisconsin, and start expanding it to other places. So I hope people will check that out.
Please do. Everybody there is incredible. Todd, obviously a favorite of mine. As always, gang, you can find me. I'm going to make this easier for you. Go to Linktree and look up Reed Galen. All my stuff is there. You don't need to make it more complicated for yourself. And also go to SezUs, SEZ.us. We are also building a social media network because why not? And also, guys, please go to jointheunion.us and sign up. And if you will, smash that contribute button, the contribute button. We need your help to start doing the work we're going to do here in the coming days, weeks, and months. Trygve Olson, thanks for coming.
Thanks for tipping me off to Linktree or whatever it is. I mean, I got to get that from you on the other end. And yes, SezUs. I'm on SezUs too. People should join SezUs.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.